Welcome to the Manly Saints Project with me, Hugh Hunter. We live in a world that struggles to understand the virtue of manliness. Our culture doesn't provide young men, or any men for that matter, with a lot of positive male role models. But our Christian tradition can provide such role models. The stories of the saints provide example after example of manly virtue. Telling these stories is what the Manly Saints Project is all about. If you enjoy my work, please consider signing up and supporting me on Substack, or click the link in the show notes to buy me a beer. And if you enjoy the podcast as audio or video, please consider giving me a rating wherever you are. It helps a lot. Now, let's meet this week's Manly Saint. Join me today to meet the brawling giant who became patron saint of the sick. Name: Camillus, Camillo, Camillus de Lellis. Life: 1550 to 1614. Status: Saint. Feast: July 14th, July 18th. Camillus de Lellis came into this world in a rather peculiar way. For one thing, it had been a very late pregnancy. His mother was almost 60 when she became pregnant for the second time with what she was quite certain was a boy. She was excited that she and her husband, a mercenary captain, might yet have a son after their first boy had died. But a strange dream complicated things. In the dream, she saw that her son had a red cross stamped on his chest. It looked to her like a brand, the sort of brand that might be put on a captured thief or bandit. And then, in the dream, she saw that her son was with a group of boys who all bore the same brand. There was the rest of the gang. She was well aware that the line between respectable mercenaries, like her husband, and bandits was not so clear as some liked to pretend, and Camillus's mother had dark forebodings about a destiny of crime and punishment when Camillus was born in the east of modern Italy in 1550 A.D. Camillus grew into a young man, and then he grew more. Soon he towered above his fellows at more than 6.5 feet tall, a large man by the standards of earlier times, but almost a giant in Renaissance Italy. Even as a boy, Camillus liked fighting and gambling. It wasn't that he was stupid. His other interest was poetry, of which he memorized a great deal. But, as teachers and then tutors hired by his parents would soon discover, Camillus wasn't interested in learning, and they couldn't figure out how to force him. When Camillus was in his late teens, his father decided to bring him into the family business. They went off together to sign up for a military campaign, but disaster struck. Camillus's father died en route, and Camillus managed to get a cut on his leg. It didn't look like much, and he soon forgot all about it, but the wound would fester and trouble him for the rest of his life. Camillus was still determined to be a mercenary, and at 6'6", he had no trouble finding employment as a guard in an Italian garrison. There was a lot of fighting to do. Christian Europe was struggling against the might of the Muslim Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Turks had captured Constantinople in 1453, and since then, Christendom had been trying to stop what seemed like a relentless advance. The Knights Hospitaller had been driven back across the Mediterranean, and had just barely held on in 1565 at the Great Siege of Malta. In 1570, the island of Cyprus was not so lucky, and fell to Islam. The Pope had intervened, gathering the squabbling heads of Europe and forming the alliance known as the Holy League. Camillus was on garrison duty when the ships of the Holy League met the Ottoman fleet off Naupactos in Greece, a place the Venetians called Lepanto. At Lepanto, something happened that had not happened for a long time. The Christians won, destroying the Ottoman fleet. it was a glorious victory. Camillus, who was on guard duty, had missed the whole thing. Fortunately for Camillus, there was still plenty of fighting to do. He headed toward Venice, hoping to get involved in whatever came next, but on the way he stopped in Rome. The wound in his leg was getting worse. He found a hospital where he could get treatment if he helped a bit as an orderly. Camillus's leg improved somewhat, but soon the hospital management found out he wasn't actually helping. Instead, he was sneaking off to gamble with the boatmen who worked the Tiber. The hospital kicked him out. By now, Camillus was healthy enough to leave, so he went off in search of a new mercenary contract. Over the next few years, Camillus's life settled into the rhythm of fighting, coming home with money, gambling it away, and then going to fight again. He sailed with an expedition to recapture a fortress near modern Kotor on the west coast of Montenegro. It was a hard fight, and the Christian forces had to sail in past the Ottoman gunners using the earliest form of handheld firearms, the culverin or early arquebus. As they sailed in, gunners like Camillus would have fired back. The Christians besieged the fortress. They ran out of food, and Camillus remembered that at one point he ate grass to stay alive. Finally, the fortress was captured, and Camillus sailed for home. Back in Italy, he gambled, losing his money, his sword, his powder horn, and literally the shirt from his back. That meant it was time to go on campaign again. Lepanto had been a great victory for Christendom. Now that the tide was turning, everyone could see that they should keep pressing the advantage against the Ottoman Turks. The Pope formed a second Holy League in 1572. But the next year, Christendom was shocked when Venice made a separate peace with the Ottomans. The Second Holy League fell apart, and the momentum drained out of Christian efforts. Europe turned inwards, nations pursuing their rivalries, as in the East, the forces of Islam recovered their strength. Camillus would view this dynamic firsthand when he witnessed the fall of Tunis in the north of modern Tunisia on the African coast. The city had been swallowed up in the initial Islamic expansion, but had since then traded hands several times. Currently it was held by the Spanish. Their French and Dutch enemies wanted to see Tunis fall because that would weaken Spain, and that had led an Ottoman fleet to sail for the city. Spain was unable to send much of a relief force, but a few other Christian nations pitched in, and Camillus was part of the expedition. Something happened that prevented Camillus and the men with him from joining the defense. Camillus's biography blames the pride of Gabriele Serbelloni, a brother of the Knights of Malta and the commander of the city. But given how badly Serbelloni was outnumbered, it seems likely that other factors were at work. The mercenaries with Camillus and two other contingents were unable to join in, and so Serbelloni and his few thousand men stood alone against an army of 100,000 Muslims. Tunis would fall, and Serbelloni would be dragged by the beard to kneel before his enemies, his men dragged away as slave rowers for Ottoman galleys. Europe would come to regret allowing Tunis to fall, as for centuries to come it would be a hub for the operations of the Barbary slavers and corsairs, who operated virtually unchallenged until the rise of a new power, the Americans. For now, all Camillus knew was that he had narrowly escaped death. Camillus was at his most religious when he seemed to be about to die. Then he'd swear that if he survived alive, he would become a monk. Off the coast of Italy, the boat carrying Camillus and the other mercenaries ran into a storm that lasted for 3 days, and Camillus made his usual promise. But when they got to shore in Naples, Camillus did what he always did. He gambled, and soon he had lost his money, his sword, and his powder flask. This time around, he stopped before losing his shirt. He heard there might be fighting to be done in the Balkans, and people were recruiting on the east coast of Italy, in Manfredonia, and so Camillus buckled his now empty sword belt and started to walk across Italy, begging for food as he went. Camillus was begging in front of a Capuchin church in Manfredonia when a Capuchin monk saw the huge beggar and offered him a job. Camillus agreed, only planning to work there a little while, to make enough money to get him to his next job, perhaps with some light gambling on the way. But as time passed, something in Camillus began to change. He listened to the Capuchins. He wanted, more and more, to be like them. On a routine trip to deliver some supplies, Camillus had a profound experience of the inadequacy of the life he was living. He returned to the monastery repeating a phrase, "No more of the world, no more of the world." Camillus thought that he was being called to be a Capuchin. The monks allowed him to enter the novitiate, but a strange thing happened. He would come in perfectly healthy, but as he got close to the end of the testing, his leg would flare up. After this had happened twice, the Capuchins told Camillus that his vocation did not lie with them. To try to cure the wound in his leg, Camillus went back to the hospital in Rome where he had been before. This time, he looked at the hospital from a new perspective. What he saw was dysfunction. It was always hard to find people to work in hospitals. Hospitals compensated by functioning as quasi-prisons, where convicted criminals would serve their term as orderlies. The convicts didn't want to be there and did as little as possible. They sometimes neglected patients who were known to be forgotten and starve in their beds. When there was a plague and everything grew chaotic, the convicts often stopped working entirely. It wasn't only a problem with the hospital staff. Even priests were terrified of getting sick and tended to hurry in, pop the Eucharist in someone's mouth, and flee while taking as few breaths as possible. Hospitals were overcrowded and underfunded. In the year of Camillus's birth, one of Rome's hospitals treated 10,000 sick people, of which only 928 managed to recover. With his new perspective, Camillus thought about Jesus' words that what we do for the sick, we do for him. Camillus was thinking along the same lines as had St. John of God a few decades earlier. There was a vocation in helping the sick. Camillus went where he thought God was calling him, becoming the man in the hospital who was willing to take care of the sickest people, who was willing to clean up any mess. Soon, he was promoted into a leadership position. His faith was contagious. He kept a skull on his table as a reminder of death, a memento mori. Not that in his line of work death was ever very far away. His spiritual life was being reshaped by the man who became his confessor and advisor, the future St. Philip Neri. In the hospital, a few men began to see things Camillus's way. Someone bought him a large crucifix, and he mounted it in a room they could use to pray in together. Camillus and his companions formed a sort of society dedicated to Camillus's vision. But the people in charge of the hospital were suspicious about this new organization. They clamped down on Camillus, told him to take back his crucifix, and dismantled the prayer room he had set up. It seemed to Camillus that he had reached another dead end. That night he fell asleep next to the crucifix, and in his dream it seemed to him that Jesus moved his head on the cross and looked over at him and began to speak. Christ on the crucifix said, "Don't be afraid, O man of small soul. Go ahead, for I will help you and be with you." These were the very words Camillus needed to hear. In the morning, he knew what he was going to do. It was simple, really. He was going to get an education. He was going to convince the church that, former mercenary that he was, he should become a priest. Then, he was going to convince the entire church hierarchy to let him found a new kind of religious order dedicated to helping the sick. Pretty much everyone thought the idea was crazy. But using the time he had at the hospital, Camillus embarked on step 1, getting an education. For Camillus, this meant returning to the schooling that he had neglected as a young man. He took lessons in a grammar school, the big man sitting awkwardly among little children. Soon, his Latin was good enough. There were other things to learn next. Time passed, and Camillus managed to find a few priests who were impressed with his progress. They said they would support his ordination. But now, money was a problem. Since Camillus was not entering an order that would provide him with a living, he needed to show that he was able to support himself and his plans. Camillus told a rich man he knew about his problems. The rich man thought Camillus' scheme was as ridiculous as everyone else did, and fobbed him off by saying that he was sure if Camillus prayed for help, help would come. The rich man went home and thought no more about it until he was struck with a sudden, irresistible certainty. God was calling him personally to help Camillus. And so the rich man returned a little sheepishly the next day with an open wallet and a business plan, and Camillus was able to be ordained. Father Camillus kept up his work in the hospital, now providing not only physical assistance, but also the sacraments to the sick and dying. Strange stories began to be told about the patient, enormous priest. One man had a broken leg that had not healed properly and become infected. The night before his leg was due to be amputated, Camillus sat with him, and they spoke quietly until the man fell asleep. In the morning, the surgeon couldn't figure out why he had been called to a man with 2 perfectly healthy legs. Even 35 years later, the man would still embarrass Father Camillus by shouting his thanks whenever he saw him on the street. In time, Camillus' small group of companions moved to another hospital in Rome. So far, they were still an unofficial group, and Camillus was moving on to step 3 of his plan, which was to somehow convince the Pope, who generally did not like new religious orders, to let him found one. To do this, Camillus would have to carefully work the Vatican hierarchy. So, he prayed for help and approached the first cardinal he met on the street. As it happened, this was a powerful and influential man, and he liked Camillus' plan. The cardinal pushed the plan through the system, bringing it to the Pope himself. The new order would take 4 vows. There were the usual vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they would also vow perpetual service to the sick. They wore a black robe with a cross on the right side of the chest. Originally, Camillus wanted the cross to be the light brown heraldic color of tawny, as we say in English. But somehow, over time, the crosses just ended up being red crosses, placed on the right side of the chest, just where Camillus' mother had dreamed them all those years before. It was somewhat unusual to wear a cross on the right side, but the way Camillus saw it, a man's left side was the shield side. The cross was a weapon, a sword, and that belonged on the right. The cross was so distinctive that people sometimes called the members of Camillus' order crucifers, cross-bearers. We usually call them servants of the sick, although a more precise translation would be ministers of the infirm. Rome's street urchins, who liked to make fun of everyone, immediately dubbed them ministers of the inferno. Camillus' organization was already spreading beyond Rome. The servants of the sick went into hospitals and did what no one else would do. And this meant that many of them got sick too. Many died. But many more saw their courage, and the order grew. In 1590, a plague broke out in Rome. The servants of the sick stepped up to help, tending the sick and providing food and clothes to those who could not leave the city. On one occasion, handing out clothing, one of the servants complained that many of these people would gamble away the clothes they were given. Camillus understood that better than most. But what he said was, "What, my brother? Do you see nothing but rags on these poor creatures? And do you not consider that under these rags may be concealed Jesus Christ himself? Camillus was now a leader. He advocated for the poor, demanding better treatment. When people stood in his way, Camillus was not above remarking that, for the love of Christ, all he was going to do was admonish them. But if it were not a question of the love of Christ, Camillus would go on, he would most certainly pick them up and throw them through a window. As the plague tore through the city, people got used to seeing the enormous priest on his rounds, bringing milk and food and even squeezing through windows to bring food and the sacraments to people who were too sick to get up to unlock the door. On one occasion, Camillus was bringing 8 sick and starving men to his hospital when one collapsed in the street. A nobleman's coach was passing by, and Camillus stepped in the way and announced, with no authority whatsoever, that he was commandeering the vehicle. The baffled nobleman got out and watched Camillus pile 8 beggars into his coach and drive it away to the hospital. Tens of thousands of Romans died, but eventually the plague came to an end. Afterwards, Camillus stepped down as leader. His leg was continuing to trouble him, and he was happy to leave the administrative headache to someone else. Camillus went back to the hospital, working as hard as ever. When he found it impossible to walk between the beds, he crawled. The servants of the sick continued to grow. By the time Camillus died in 1614, at the age of 65, 220 servants of the sick had died in their mission of helping in hospitals. And yet, their courage had inspired so many others that the order was 300 strong. The order that St. Camillus founded, now known as the Camillians, would continue to flourish under his patronage. The red cross of St. Camillus would be adapted, becoming the symbol of all who help the sick. St. Camillus himself would be adapted, with elements of his story inspiring the figure of Don Camillo, the priest in the beloved Catholic stories of Giovanni Guareschi. And as for the real St. Camillus, the Church would come to see him and St. John of God as the 2 great patrons, both of the sick and of those who tend to them.